The county auctioneer's gavel fell at $460, and Thomas Brennan became the owner of a condemned cannery he'd never seen inside, in a town he'd driven through once, with money that was supposed to pay next month's rent. His 7-year-old daughter Lucy sat beside him in the folding chair, her small hand gripping his, both of them understanding that this gamble was desperation masquerading as strategy, that buying a foreclosed industrial building when you were 3 weeks from eviction wasn't brave, it was the last move of someone who'd run out of safe options. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Thomas had found the auction listing online while searching for storage units they could afford, a last-ditch effort to salvage belongings before losing the apartment they'd rented since Lucy's mother died 18 months ago. Cardiac arrest at 32, sudden and inexplicable, leaving Thomas with a daughter, medical debt that consumed his construction wages, and the hollowed-out feeling of navigating life without the person who'd made it make sense. The cannery sat at the edge of Riverside, Oregon, a town that had once thrived on agricultural processing before the industry moved elsewhere and left buildings like this to rot. The auction description had been sparse: commercial property, 12,000 square feet, water access, sold as is, condemned status, buyer responsible for all liens and back taxes. The accompanying photographs showed a brick building with broken windows, a collapsed loading dock, and enough decay to scare off serious bidders. Thomas had bid anyway, driven by calculations that felt insane even as he made them. The property had 12,000 square feet, even condemned, that was shelter. The building sat on the Willamette River, that was water access if the municipal supply was cut. The back taxes totaled $8,000, painful but manageable if he could find work and make payments. Most importantly, $460 was everything he had left after paying utilities and buying groceries, was exactly the amount that meant choosing between a security deposit on a new apartment he couldn't afford anyway or gambling on property he might be able to salvage into something. The other bidders at the county auction had been developers and salvage companies, people with resources and plans. They dropped out early when the cannery's structural issues became clear through the auctioneer's legally required disclosures. Foundation problems, asbestos in the insulation, lead paint on every surface, electrical systems that hadn't been code compliant since the 1940s. The building wasn't just condemned, it was a liability that would cost hundreds of thousands to remediate before it could be legally occupied or demolished. But Thomas had learned in 7 years of construction work that condemned didn't always mean worthless, that industrial buildings were built to standards modern construction rarely matched. Brick walls 2 feet thick, timber framing from old-growth forest, foundations designed to support machinery that weighed tons. If the core structure was sound, everything else was just expensive problems that patient work could eventually solve. The auctioneer had looked at Thomas with something approaching pity when he'd raised his paddle for the final bid, had asked twice if he understood the property's condition and the financial obligations he was assuming. Thomas had confirmed both, had signed papers that made him the legal owner of a building he couldn't afford to fix and couldn't afford not to own, had taken the keys that felt heavier than brass should weigh. Lucy had been quiet through the drive from the auction house to the cannery, her silence carrying the weight of someone who'd learned too young that adult decisions often led to consequences children had to navigate. She'd been like that since her mother died, watchful and careful, processing the world with gravity that 7-year-olds shouldn't need. The cannery looked worse in person than it had in photographs. The building sprawled along the riverbank, 3 stories of red brick darkened by a century of weather and industrial soot. Windows on the upper floors were broken or missing entirely, their frames hanging like broken teeth. The loading dock had collapsed inward, creating a gap in the building's side that exposed machinery frozen in rust. Graffiti covered the lower walls, tags and murals that marked the building as territory claimed and abandoned by generations of kids who'd used it as playground. A chain-link fence surrounded the property, its gate hanging open where someone had cut the padlock years ago. Warning signs about structural instability and toxic materials were faded to near illegibility. The river flowed past 20 yards from the building's rear wall, dark water carrying the smell of silt and distance. Thomas parked their aging pickup truck outside the fence and sat for a moment looking at what he'd bought, feeling the weight of choices that couldn't be unmade settle into his bones. This building represented everything he had left: money, hope, the stubborn belief that desperate gambles sometimes paid off if you were willing to work hard enough and accept whatever came. "It's really big," Lucy said quietly, her first words since leaving the auction. "Do we have to live in all of it? We'll figure out a small section we can make safe and warm. The rest we'll deal with over time." Thomas tried to sound confident, tried to project certainty he didn't feel. "Come on, let's see what we actually bought." The main entrance was secured with a newer padlock, municipal code enforcement's final touch before condemning the property. Thomas used the keys the auctioneer had provided, the lock opening with resistance that suggested it hadn't been turned in years. The door swung inward on hinges that screamed, revealing darkness that smelled of mold and rust in time. Thomas's flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing a reception area that had been stripped of anything valuable decades ago. The floor was concrete, cracked but solid. The walls were brick, water-stained but intact. The ceiling was pressed tin, sagging in places but mostly whole. Beyond the reception area, the main processing floor opened up, a vast space easily 100 feet long and 60 feet wide, its ceiling 2 stories overhead supported by timber columns that looked like they'd been cut from trees that had been saplings when the nation was young. Industrial equipment filled the space in various states of decay. Conveyor systems that had once moved produce from washing stations to processing lines, now frozen in rust. Cooking vats large enough to hold hundreds of gallons, their copper surfaces corroded green. Labeling machines and sealing equipment and all the complex machinery of early 20th century food processing, abandoned when the business failed and left to deteriorate through 8 decades of neglect. But beneath the decay, Thomas could see quality. The brick walls were plumb and solid, showing none of the cracking that indicated foundation failure. The timber framing was massive and sound, the kind of old-growth Douglas fir that modern construction couldn't replicate. The floor was scored concrete, industrial-grade material designed to withstand decades of heavy use. This building had been built to last by people who measured worth through permanence rather than cost efficiency. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Lucy stayed close as they explored, her small hand finding Thomas's whenever the darkness pressed too close or strange sounds echoed through the vast space. They found offices on the 2nd floor, their windows broken but their structure intact. They found storage rooms filled with detritus from multiple eras of abandonment. They found bathrooms with fixtures that had been scavenged for copper decades ago. It was in the basement that Thomas found both hope and complication. The stairs descended from the main processing floor, concrete steps leading down into darkness that smelled different from the rest of the building, drier somehow, less affected by the moisture that had claimed the upper levels. Thomas's flashlight revealed a space that ran the building's full length, maybe 10 feet ceiling height, its walls lined with wooden shelving that still held mason jars from the cannery's final years of operation. But it was the far wall that drew his attention. Unlike the rest of the basement, which was bare brick, this section was covered with wooden paneling that looked both newer and more deliberately placed than simple decoration would require. Thomas approached it carefully, pressing against the panels, finding hollow spaces that suggested something behind the wall. One section of paneling moved slightly under pressure, revealing it wasn't attached to the brick but rather set in a frame. Thomas pulled it outward, the panel coming free to reveal not solid wall behind it but an opening into a hidden room that his flashlight couldn't fully illuminate. "Dad, what is that?" Lucy's voice carried fear and curiosity in equal measure. "I don't know yet. Stay here while I check it out." Thomas squeezed through the opening, finding himself in a chamber maybe 20 feet square, its walls lined with wooden crates stacked floor to ceiling. The air smelled of old wood and something sharp he couldn't immediately identify. His flashlight beam revealed stenciled text on the crates: Canadian Whiskey 1927, Kentucky Bourbon 1925, Scottish Whiskey 1929. Understanding hit Thomas with the force of historical knowledge suddenly made personal. This wasn't just a hidden room, it was a Prohibition-era cache, alcohol stored when its sale was illegal, hidden in a cannery that provided perfect cover for smuggling operations. The dates on the crates ranged from 1924 to 1932, spanning most of the Prohibition period that had turned alcohol distribution into criminal enterprise and had made fortunes for people willing to break laws everyone ignored. Thomas pried open one crate, finding bottles wrapped in straw, their labels faded but legible. Canadian Club whiskey, bottled in 1927, 95 years old and probably worth more as antiques than as alcohol. He opened another crate, bourbon from a Kentucky distillery that no longer existed, its bottles sealed with wax that had somehow survived 9 decades in this hidden room. There were at least 100 crates visible in the flashlight beam, maybe more in sections the light didn't reach. If each crate held 12 bottles, and each bottle was worth even $100 as a Prohibition-era collectible, Thomas was looking at 6 figures minimum. If some bottles were rare or from famous distilleries, the value could be substantially higher. He was still processing the discovery when he heard voices from above, multiple people entering the cannery, their footsteps echoing through the main processing floor. Thomas moved back through the opening, pulled Lucy close, and listened as the voices grew louder, approaching the basement stairs. "I told you someone bought it at auction," a man's voice said, carrying authority and irritation. "Probably some fool who thought they could flip condemned property for profit. We'll make them an offer they can't refuse, get them out before they discover anything that complicates our plans." 2 men descended the stairs, flashlights cutting through the darkness. The older one, maybe 60, wore expensive casual clothes that looked out of place in the dusty basement. The younger one, perhaps 30, had the build and bearing of someone used to getting his way through physical presence. They stopped when their lights found Thomas and Lucy near the hidden wall panel. "Well," the older man said, his tone shifting from confident to calculating. "You must be the new owner." "I'm Robert Caldwell. My family owned this cannery from 1919 until it closed in 1985. I'm here to make you an offer for the property." Thomas kept his body between the men and Lucy, kept his voice neutral. "I just bought it 2 hours ago. Haven't even had time to assess what I've got." "What you've got is a condemned building with toxic materials and structural problems that will cost $500,000 to fix." Caldwell pulled out a business card. "I'm prepared to offer you $20,000, paid in cash today, to deed the property back to me. That's a substantial profit on your investment and saves you the headache of dealing with code enforcement and remediation costs. Why would you pay $20,000 for a building you say is worthless?" "Sentiment. My grandfather built this cannery, my father ran it for 40 years. I'd like to see it returned to family ownership before it's demolished." Caldwell's smile didn't reach his eyes. "The offer is generous and time-limited. If you're smart, you'll take it." Thomas thought about the hidden room, about the crates of Prohibition-era alcohol worth far more than $20,000, about men who showed up within hours of a property changing hands to make offers they claimed were generous. This wasn't sentiment, this was people who knew what the building contained and who'd been waiting for foreclosure to give them access. "I need time to think about it," Thomas said carefully. "I just took ownership, haven't even seen the whole property yet." The younger man spoke for the first time, his voice carrying threat barely disguised as friendly advice. "Mr. Caldwell is being generous. This building is a liability, not an asset. You've got a kid to worry about. You really want to deal with the complications that come with trying to develop condemned property?" I said I need time to think. Caldwell's expression hardened. "You've got 72 hours. After that, the offer drops to $10,000, and we start looking at other options for acquiring the property." He handed Thomas the business card. "Call me when you're ready to be reasonable." After they left, Thomas stood in the basement holding a business card from people who'd shown up too quickly and offered too much for property they claimed was worthless. He thought about the hidden room and its contents, about the fact that the Caldwell family had owned the cannery during Prohibition, about the likelihood that someone in their family had stashed illegal alcohol and had been waiting 8 decades for the chance to reclaim it. Lucy tugged at his sleeve. "Are they bad people, Dad?" "I think they're people who want something they believe belongs to them, who are willing to pressure us to get it." Thomas knelt down to her level. "But we're going to figure this out carefully, going to understand what we actually have before we make any decisions. Okay?" She nodded, trusting him in ways that made his chest tight with the responsibility of being the only parent she had left. As darkness fell over the cannery and Thomas set up a camping setup in the least damaged office space, he thought about the discovery that changed everything. The building he'd bought for $460 held a fortune in Prohibition-era alcohol, stored by people who'd planned to reclaim it but never had. The Caldwell family knew it was there, had been circling the property for years waiting for foreclosure to give them access, and now they were desperate to acquire it before Thomas discovered what he'd accidentally bought. He thought about his daughters sleeping in a camping bag on a concrete floor, about the apartment they'd lost, about the medical debt and eviction notices and desperate gambles that had led them here. The cannery represented both opportunity and danger, wealth and complication, the chance to build security or the risk of fighting battles against people with resources and patience. Outside, the river flowed past in darkness, carrying water that had witnessed the cannery's construction and operation, that had been here when someone had built that hidden room and filled it with illegal alcohol, that would continue flowing long after Thomas and Lucy and the Caldwell family had made their choices and faced their consequences. The building settled around them with the creaks and groans of old structures finding their balance, and Thomas committed himself to understanding what he'd inherited before deciding whether to keep it or surrender it to people who'd shown up too quickly with offers that were either generous or calculated to acquire something worth far more than they were willing to admit. Sleep came slowly in the darkness of the condemned cannery, and with it the understanding that tomorrow would bring choices that would define whether desperation had led them to salvation or to complications that would make eviction look simple by comparison. Thomas woke at dawn to Lucy's small voice asking if they could use the bathroom, the question carrying the weight of reality that camping in condemned buildings came with consequences children shouldn't have to navigate. He'd found a gas station 3 blocks away the night before, had noted its hours, had added fine-functioning plumbing to the growing list of problems that $460 in a foreclosed cannery had created. After taking Lucy to the gas station and buying her breakfast from the convenience store with money he couldn't afford to spend, Thomas returned to the cannery with new understanding of how quickly desperation could accelerate. They had shelter but not safety, property but not habitability, and a hidden fortune that represented either salvation or the beginning of battles he wasn't equipped to fight. He spent the morning documenting everything with his phone camera, the building's structure, the industrial equipment, the hidden room and its contents. He photographed bottle labels, crate markings, anything that might help establish what he'd actually found. Some bottles had distillery names he recognized from liquor store shelves. Others bore labels from operations that had closed during Prohibition and never reopened. While Lucy drew pictures in a relatively clean office space Thomas had cleared for her, he used the gas station's Wi-Fi to research Prohibition-era alcohol values. What he found both excited and terrified him. Common bottles from the 1920s sold for hundreds of dollars to collectors. Rare bottles from famous distilleries or significant years could sell for thousands. The most valuable Prohibition-era whiskey ever auctioned had gone for over $20,000, a single bottle. If even a quarter of the bottles in that hidden room were genuinely valuable, Thomas was looking at enough money to pay off medical debt, secure stable housing, give Lucy the childhood security her mother's death had stolen. But claiming that value meant navigating legal complexities he didn't understand, meant standing against people who'd been waiting decades for access to what they clearly believed was theirs, meant choosing to fight when fighting required resources he didn't have. He was photographing bottle labels when his phone rang, a local number he didn't recognize. "Mr. Brennan, my name is Helen Marsh. I was the county recorder for 40 years before retiring, and I heard through town gossip that someone finally bought the old Riverside cannery. I'm calling because there are things you should know about that property before you make any decisions about it." They met at a diner in town, Helen arriving with a manila folder thick with documents she'd copied from county records over the years. She was maybe 75, sharp-eyed and direct in the way of people who'd spent careers dealing with uncomfortable truths. "The Caldwell family has been trying to reacquire that cannery since it was seized for back taxes in 2003, Helen said, spreading documents across the table while Lucy colored in a nearby booth. "They've made multiple offers to the county, tried to block it from public auction, filed legal challenges claiming they had rights to the property that superseded tax liens. The county rejected everything because the Caldwells had sold the property to a holding company in 1985, had no legal standing to reclaim it. Why are they so determined to get it back? That's the question I've been asking for 20 years. Helen pulled out property records from the 1920s. The cannery was built in 1919 by Robert Caldwell's grandfather, Samuel Caldwell. Official records show it operated as a produce cannery throughout the 1920s and 1930s, processing fruit from local farms. But there were always rumors about other operations, about trucks arriving at night, about the Caldwells having money that seemed disproportionate to what a small cannery should generate. Prohibition smuggling. That was the assumption, though nothing was ever proven. The cannery's location on the river made it perfect for receiving shipments from Canada, and Samuel Caldwell had connections with distributors across Oregon and Washington. After Prohibition ended in 1933, the cannery continued operating legitimately for another 50 years. Helen paused. But here's what's interesting. In 1932, Samuel Caldwell died suddenly at age 48. Heart attack, according to the death certificate. His son Charles, Robert's father, took over operations, but apparently never found something Samuel had hidden. Family legend says Samuel stashed a fortune in illegal alcohol somewhere in the cannery, intended to sell it after Prohibition ended, but died before revealing the location. Thomas felt pieces falling into place. So 3 generations of Caldwells have been trying to reclaim property they sold, believing there's hidden alcohol they never found. Exactly. And now someone bought it for pocket change at a county auction, which means the Caldwells just lost their last chance at legal acquisition. They're going to pressure you hard, Thomas. Robert Caldwell has spent his entire life believing his grandfather's fortune is hidden in that building, has told anyone who'd listen that reclaiming it is his birthright. Men with that kind of obsession don't surrender easily. After Helen left, Thomas sat in the diner processing information that transformed his discovery from lucky find into inheritance dispute across generations. The alcohol in that hidden room wasn't just valuable, it represented something the Caldwell family had been seeking for 90 years, wealth they'd convinced themselves belonged to them despite having sold the property decades ago. He returned to the cannery to find a black SUV parked outside, Robert Caldwell leaning against it with the younger man from yesterday, who Helen's documents had identified as Robert's son, David. Both straightened when Thomas's truck pulled up. "Mr. Brennan," Robert said, his tone less friendly than their first meeting. "I hope you've had time to reconsider our offer. $20,000 is more than generous for property in this condition." "I'm still assessing what I have," Thomas said carefully, positioning himself between the Caldwells and Lucy, who'd stayed in the truck. "I need more than 2 days to make decisions about property I just bought. What you have is a liability that will consume whatever money you thought you'd save by buying it." David Caldwell stepped forward, his body language deliberately intimidating. "The building needs complete asbestos abatement, lead paint remediation, structural repairs. You're looking at $500,000 in costs before you could legally occupy or demolish it. Our offer saves you from that burden. Or your offer is an attempt to acquire something you know is worth more than you're admitting." Thomas kept his voice level. "Your family has been trying to reacquire this property for 20 years. That's not sentiment, that's people who believe there's something valuable here." Robert's mask of civility dropped. "This property belonged to my family for 66 years. My grandfather built it, my father ran it, I grew up in these buildings. Whatever's here is ours by right if not by law, and you're making a serious mistake by refusing to cooperate." "Are you threatening me?" "I'm explaining reality. You're a construction worker with a child and no permanent address. Fighting us will require lawyers and money and time you don't have. Our offer is the smart choice for someone in your position." Robert pulled out a business envelope. $20,000 in cash, right now, in exchange for quitclaim deed signing the property over to us. Take it and walk away with more money than you started with." Thomas thought about Lucy in the truck behind him, about the gas station bathroom they'd used that morning, about medical debt and eviction notices and the apartment they'd lost. $20,000 was real money, would solve immediate problems, would give them stability for months while he found work and rebuilt their lives. But it would also mean surrendering to pressure from people who measured worth through intimidation, would mean teaching Lucy that standing for things mattered less than accepting whatever powerful people offered when they made your life difficult. The answer is no, Thomas said. The property is mine, legally purchased at a public auction. Whatever your family believes about birthright or hidden fortunes doesn't change that I own it now. David Caldwell moved closer, his physical presence clearly intended to intimidate. You're being stupid. We're offering you an easy out from an impossible situation. Keep refusing, and you'll discover how expensive and complicated defending your position actually gets. Are we done here? Thomas kept his ground, kept his voice steady despite the adrenaline making his hands shake. We're done being nice, Robert said coldly. You've got 48 hours before our offer drops to $10,000. After that, we pursue other methods of acquisition, and you'll wish you'd taken the easy money when it was offered. After they left, Thomas stood in the Cannery's parking lot feeling the weight of choices that had seemed straightforward but were revealing themselves as complicated by history and obsession and the toxic legacy of families who believed owning something once gave them permanent claim to it. Lucy climbed out of the truck, her small hand finding his. They're mean people, Dad. Like the landlord who yelled at you when we couldn't pay rent. Yeah, they are. But sometimes you have to stand up to mean people, even when they're stronger than you. Thomas knelt to her level. I'm going to fight for this building, which means things might be hard for a while. You okay with that? She nodded with the seriousness of children who'd learned that life was hard regardless of choices adults made. Mom always said you were stubborn. Is this what she meant? The mention of her mother hit Thomas in the chest, brought tears he couldn't afford right now. Yeah, this is exactly what she meant. Come on, let's figure out what we're actually fighting for. Over the following days, Thomas worked systematically to understand both the cannery's structure and the alcohol's value. He contacted auction houses specializing in vintage spirits, sent photographs of labels and bottles, received estimates that ranged from conservative to staggering depending on authenticity and condition. The consensus was that he needed professional appraisal, that Prohibition-era alcohol required expertise to properly evaluate and sell. But expertise cost money Thomas didn't have, and accessing the bottles required occupying a building he couldn't legally inhabit. He was caught in the circular trap of needing resources to claim value that would provide those resources, and all while the Caldwells circled like predators waiting for him to make mistakes they could exploit. He found an ally in unexpected form. Margaret Torres was a lawyer who'd grown up in Riverside, had left for law school and returned to practice focusing on property rights and historic preservation. She'd heard about the cannery sale through town gossip and had her own history with the Caldwell family. They pressured my parents into selling a commercial building in 1998, Margaret told Thomas when they met at her office. Used the same tactics they're using with you, offers that seemed generous until you refused, then escalating pressure that made fighting more expensive than surrendering. My parents sold for less than the property was worth because the stress of fighting wasn't worth the difference. I've regretted not being old enough or experienced enough to help them ever since. She agreed to work on contingency, percentage of whatever value Thomas eventually realized from the property, payment deferred until he had resources. In exchange, she'd handle the legal work of defending his ownership, navigating the code enforcement complications, and dealing with whatever pressure the Caldwells applied. They're going to file nuisance claims, Margaret warned. Challenge your title, report you to code enforcement for occupying condemned property, make your life difficult through legal channels that cost money even when they're baseless. That's their pattern, use the legal system as a weapon to wear down opposition until selling looks easier than fighting. The predicted harassment began within days. Code enforcement cited Thomas for trespassing in a condemned building, though he owned it legally. The Caldwells filed a claim asserting they had prior purchase agreements that superseded the county auction, though they produced no documentation. Someone reported Thomas to Child Protective Services for housing Lucy in unsafe conditions, triggering an investigation that terrified him with visions of losing his daughter to a system that measured fitness through stability he couldn't provide. Through it all, Thomas continued working on the cannery in whatever time he could spare from dealing with legal harassment. He cleared debris, assessed structural problems, began the slow process of making small sections safe enough for basic occupancy. The building revealed itself as better constructed than he'd hoped. The brick walls were solid, the timber framing was sound, the foundation showed no signs of the failure that would make the property unsalvageable. He also discovered more about Samuel Caldwell's operation. Hidden behind a false wall in the office, he found ledgers documenting alcohol smuggling from 1924 to 1932, showing quantities and distributors and profits that confirmed the cannery had been cover for substantial illegal operations. The ledgers stopped abruptly in August 1932, the month Samuel died, last entry showing incoming shipments but no distribution records, suggesting Samuel had received alcohol he'd never sold before his sudden death. Margaret used the ledgers to strengthen Thomas's position. These prove Samuel Caldwell was running criminal operations from this property. Any claim the Caldwell family makes about rights to what's hidden here is essentially arguing they have legal standing to criminal proceeds their grandfather stashed 90 years ago. No court will honor that. But legal correctness didn't stop the pressure. Robert Caldwell called repeatedly with revised offers, $15,000, $12,000, $10,000 in descending amounts that revealed his desperation. David Caldwell showed up at the cannery at odd hours, documenting Thomas's work, looking for code violations or safety issues he could report. The campaign was designed to make every day more difficult than the last, to wear down Thomas's resistance through accumulated stress until surrender looked reasonable. The Child Protective Services investigation was particularly painful. A caseworker visited the cannery, documented that Thomas and Lucy were essentially camping in a condemned building, expressed concerns about stability and Lucy's welfare. Thomas explained the circumstances, the foreclosure, the medical debt, the cannery representing their only asset and potential path to security. The caseworker was sympathetic but clear that Lucy couldn't continue living in these conditions indefinitely. "I'm not removing her today," the caseworker said after interviewing Lucy, who'd been characteristically mature in explaining their situation. "But I need to see progress towards stable housing within 30 days, or we'll have to revisit placement options. I understand you're doing your best in impossible circumstances, but Lucy deserves better than camping in industrial buildings." After the caseworker left, Thomas sat in the office that had become their temporary home, feeling the weight of 30-day deadlines that seemed impossible to meet. Making the cannery legally habitable would take months and money he didn't have. Selling the alcohol required appraisals and auction arrangements that couldn't be rushed. Fighting the Caldwells was consuming time and energy he needed for solving the actual problems of shelter and income. Lucy found him there as evening light slanted through broken windows, her 7-year-old frame small in the doorway but her expression carrying the gravity she developed since her mother died. "Are they going to take me away?" she asked quietly. "Like they took Mom?" The question broke something in Thomas, brought tears he'd been holding back through months of desperate choices and accumulated failures. He pulled Lucy close, felt her small body against his, felt the weight of being the only parent she had left and the fear that he was failing at the one job that mattered most. "I won't let that happen," he said, knowing he couldn't promise what he couldn't control but needing to offer certainty anyway. "We're going to figure this out, going to make this place safe enough that they can see we're moving toward stability. Okay?" She nodded against his chest, trusting him in ways that made the responsibility feel overwhelming. That night, after Lucy fell asleep in her camping bag, Thomas walked through the cannery in darkness thinking about choices that kept narrowing. He could sell to the Caldwells for whatever they were currently offering, $10,000 that would provide a few months of stability but would mean surrendering to pressure and teaching Lucy that powerful people always won. He could try to hold out until he could properly appraise and sell the alcohol, but that timeline didn't match the 30 days Child Services had given him. He could abandon the cannery entirely, declare bankruptcy on the medical debt, start over with nothing but whatever minimum wage work he could find. None of the options felt adequate. All of them involved loss, of property, of principal, of the security he'd gambled everything to try to build. He stood in the hidden room among crates that represented both fortune and complication, thinking about Samuel Caldwell dying before selling alcohol he'd stashed, about 3 generations of Caldwells convinced that wealth belonged to them, about his own daughter sleeping upstairs in a condemned building because her father had made desperate gambles that kept leading to harder choices. The bottles sat in silent rows, 90-year-old whiskey that had outlasted the laws that made it illegal, that had survived through generations of people believing it was theirs to claim. Samuel Caldwell had hidden it and died protecting its location. Robert Caldwell had spent his life trying to find it. And Thomas had stumbled into ownership through county auction and desperation, had discovered what others had been seeking but now had to decide whether claiming it was worth what claiming would cost. The cannery settled around him with the groans of old buildings finding their balance, and Thomas committed himself to one more day of standing ground, one more day of refusing to surrender, one more day of believing that desperate gambles sometimes paid off if you were stubborn enough to outlast the people who had resources but not the moral clarity that came from having nothing left to lose except the daughter sleeping upstairs and the principle that ownership mattered even when defending it was expensive. Tomorrow would bring more pressure, more harassment, more difficult choices between principle and pragmatism. But tonight, Thomas owned a cannery and a hidden fortune and the stubborn belief that sometimes refusing to quit was the only move left when every other option looked like different versions of defeat. The turning point came from an unexpected source. A journalist named David Chin had been researching Prohibition-era smuggling operations along the Willamette River for a book about Oregon's bootlegging history. He'd heard through Margaret's network about the cannery discovery and contacted Thomas with an offer that was part research collaboration, part lifeline. If you'll let me document the hidden room and its contents for my book, I can connect you with specialists who'll appraise the alcohol for a percentage of eventual sale value rather than upfront fees, David explained during their first meeting. I also know collectors who'd be interested in purchasing specific bottles, and auction houses that handle Prohibition memorabilia. More importantly, publicity about this discovery creates pressure that works in your favor. The Caldwells can't quietly intimidate you if there's media attention on what you found. Thomas agreed, understanding that transparency was his best defense against people who operated through shadowy pressure tactics. Within a week, David's preliminary article appeared in a regional history magazine, complete with photographs of the hidden room and its contents. The response was immediate and larger than either of them had anticipated. Collectors contacted Thomas directly with offers for specific bottles. An auction house in Seattle expressed interest in handling a specialized sale of the entire collection. A museum curator wanted to discuss preserving some bottles as historical artifacts. Most importantly, the publicity brought attention that made the Caldwells' harassment campaign suddenly visible to people who cared about historic preservation and who didn't appreciate seeing property owners bullied over legitimate discoveries. The local historical society published an editorial supporting Thomas's ownership rights and condemning the Caldwells' attempts to claim property they'd sold decades earlier. The State Historic Preservation Office opened an inquiry into whether the cannery and its Prohibition-era cache qualified for landmark status, which would complicate any attempt to demolish or radically alter the building. The attention didn't solve Thomas's immediate problems, but it changed the dynamic from isolated property owner versus wealthy family to public interest story that people were watching. Robert Caldwell's response revealed how much the publicity threatened his strategy. He called Thomas, his voice carrying fury barely controlled. "You've made this very complicated for yourself," Robert said. "That alcohol was acquired through criminal enterprise by my grandfather. You're essentially trying to profit from stolen property, and we will pursue every legal avenue to prevent that. Your grandfather ran illegal operations on property your family no longer owns," Thomas replied, Margaret having coached him on exactly how to frame this. "Any claim you make to proceeds from those operations requires admitting your family engaged in criminal enterprise and that you believe you have inheritance rights to criminal proceeds. No court will support that argument. We'll see what courts support after my lawyers are done filing challenges to your ownership, to the authenticity of what you found, to your legal right to sell alcohol that may not have proper tax stamps." Robert's voice carried the edge of someone who was running out of options but wasn't ready to surrender. "You've started a fight you can't afford to finish." But the publicity had already shifted the equation. A specialist in Prohibition-era spirits flew in from California, assessed the collection, and confirmed that Thomas had bottles worth between $300,000 and $450,000 depending on auction results. More importantly, the specialist agreed to handle authentication and sale arrangements for a percentage rather than upfront fees, solving the resource problem that had made claiming the value seem impossible. The appraisal created legal complications the Caldwells immediately exploited. They filed a claim asserting the alcohol couldn't be sold without proper tax documentation, that Prohibition-era bottles might not have the stamps required for legal sale. They petitioned the state to seize the collection pending investigation into whether it represented unpaid taxes or criminal proceeds subject to forfeiture. Margaret countered each filing with documentation showing that Prohibition-era alcohol was regularly sold at auction, that tax requirements didn't apply to antiques, that criminal proceeds claims required proving Thomas had participated in the original crimes rather than simply discovering their results 90 years later. The legal maneuvering consumed weeks and created uncertainty about when Thomas could actually access the value he'd discovered. Meanwhile, the 30-day deadline from Child Protective Services was approaching with Thomas no closer to stable housing than he'd been when the caseworker visited. He'd made progress on the cannery, had cleared debris from several rooms, had restored basic electrical service to one section, had begun addressing some of the safety issues that made the building legally uninhabitable. But progress wasn't the same as completion, and he was running out of time to demonstrate that camping in the cannery was transitioning toward actual housing rather than just extended homelessness. It was Lucy's teacher who provided the solution Thomas hadn't seen. Mrs. Peterson had noticed Lucy's situation through the careful attention teachers develop for students dealing with instability. She'd called Thomas in for a conference, had listened to his explanation of the circumstances, and had made a suggestion that felt both generous and practical. "My mother has a small rental house that's been vacant since her last tenant moved out 3 months ago," Mrs. Peterson said. "She's been reluctant to rent it again because managing properties at her age is exhausting. But she might be willing to let you and Lucy stay there temporarily if you handle maintenance and minor repairs instead of paying full rent. It's not charity, she needs someone reliable to keep the place from deteriorating, and you need stable housing while you work out the cannery situation." The house was modest, 2 bedrooms, old but maintained, with a yard and working plumbing and all the basic infrastructure that made it legally habitable. Mrs. Peterson's mother, Frances, was 78 and direct in the way of people who'd spent lives managing rental properties. "I'm doing this for Lucy, not for you," Frances said bluntly when showing Thomas the house. "That child shouldn't be living in a condemned building because her father made risky choices. You keep this place maintained, you handle repairs when things break, you don't miss the reduced rent I'm charging, and Lucy gets stability while you sort out whatever mess you've created with that cannery." Thomas accepted the terms with gratitude that made his throat tight, understanding that this was the kind of community support his pride had made him reluctant to seek but that Lucy needed regardless of his feelings about accepting help. They moved into the house that weekend, Lucy's joy at having her own bedroom and a bathroom that worked revealing how much the cannery camping had cost her even when she'd been too mature to complain. With stable housing secured, Thomas could focus on the longer-term work of actually developing the cannery's potential. The alcohol sale would take months to arrange properly, authentication, auction preparation, legal clearances. But in the meantime, the building itself had value beyond just housing Prohibition-era bottles. A commercial real estate appraiser assessed the property, finding that despite its condemned status, the core structure was sound enough to justify investment and renovation. The location on the river made it valuable for mixed-use development. The historic architecture made it eligible for preservation grants and tax credits. With working capital, the cannery could be transformed from liability into productive property. Thomas didn't have capital, but he had construction skills and growing community support from people who'd watched his fight against the Caldwells and had decided he deserved help. A local contractor offered to supervise major work at reduced rates if Thomas handled labor. An architectural firm specializing in historic preservation agreed to design renovation plans for a percentage of future value rather than upfront fees. The Regional Development Authority approved preliminary planning for mixed-use conversion, apartments on upper floors, commercial space on the ground level, preserving the building's historic character while creating modern utility. The work progressed slowly through fall and winter, Thomas spending weekends and evenings at the cannery while maintaining part-time construction jobs that paid immediate bills. Lucy adapted to the routine, school during the week, helping at the cannery on weekends when tasks were safe enough for 7-year-old participation. She developed ownership of the project in ways that surprised Thomas, would tell classmates about our building and explain the renovation plans with enthusiasm that suggested the cannery represented more than just property. The Caldwells' harassment continued but with diminishing effectiveness. Each legal filing Margaret countered, each pressure tactic that became public knowledge through David Chen's ongoing coverage of the story, each month that Thomas held onto the property despite their efforts, all of it slowly undermined their position and revealed their campaign as obsessive rather than legitimate. The shift became undeniable when Robert Caldwell's own family began distancing themselves from his pursuit. David Caldwell stopped appearing at the cannery, stopped participating in his father's legal maneuvers. According to town gossip that reached Thomas through multiple sources, David's wife had finally insisted that the cannery obsession was poisoning their family, that Robert's decades-long quest to reclaim what his grandfather had hidden was costing them relationships and credibility for no gain. A letter arrived in March, 8 months after Thomas had bought the cannery at auction. It was from David Caldwell, handwritten, carrying the weight of someone finally acknowledging truths that were easier to avoid. Mr. Brennan, I'm writing to apologize for my role in pressuring you over the cannery property. My father has spent my entire life obsessed with reclaiming what his grandfather supposedly hid there, has told me since childhood that recovering that fortune was family duty and personal mission. I participated in tactics I'm not proud of because I believed I was honoring family legacy, but I've come to understand I was just enabling obsession that's damaged 3 generations of Caldwells. My great-grandfather Samuel built wealth through criminal enterprise during Prohibition. That's not legacy, that's history I have no claim to. You discovered what he hid, you own the property legally, and you've fought for it with more integrity than we showed trying to take it from you. I'm withdrawing from my father's legal challenges and encouraging him to do the same, though I can't control his choices. I hope you and your daughter find the security you were seeking when you made that desperate bid at the county auction. Sometimes the people who deserve good fortune are the ones who fight for it rather than the ones who believe they're entitled to it. David Caldwell. Thomas read the letter twice, feeling the complicated emotions that came with receiving apologies from people who'd made his life difficult but who'd been shaped by family dynamics they hadn't chosen. David's withdrawal from the fight didn't end Robert's harassment, but it signaled that even the Caldwell family recognized the campaign was failing, that Thomas's stubborn refusal to surrender had outlasted their resources and patience. The alcohol auction happened in June, 13 months after Thomas had bought the cannery. The specialist had authenticated the collection, had created catalog descriptions emphasizing the historical significance and rarity. Collectors from across the country participated, bidding driving prices beyond even optimistic estimates. When the final sales tallied, Thomas had proceeds of $412,000 after auction fees and the specialist's percentage. The money transformed everything, paid off medical debt that had hung over him since Lucy's mother died, provided capital for continuing cannery renovation, funded stable housing and the kind of security Lucy deserved. But more than the money, the sale represented validation that his desperate gamble had been justified, that sometimes standing ground against people with more resources paid off when you were too stubborn or too desperate to surrender. Robert Caldwell made one final attempt at contact, calling Thomas the week after the auction results became public. "You got lucky," Robert said, his voice carrying bitterness that 90 years of family obsession had finally ended in defeat. "That alcohol should have been ours, should have been sold by the family that acquired it. You stumbled into fortune you didn't earn. I earned it by standing against you when you tried to steal it through pressure and harassment," Thomas replied, no longer interested in diplomacy with someone who'd spent months making his life difficult. "Your grandfather hid illegal alcohol and died before selling it. You spent your life believing that gave you rights to it, but you were wrong. The property belonged to whoever bought it legally, and I did that. Whatever you believe about entitlement doesn't change the reality that I won and you lost." After Robert hung up, Thomas stood in the Cannery's renovated office thinking about inheritance and entitlement, about the difference between deserving things and believing you deserve them. The Caldwell family had convinced themselves across 3 generations that Samuel's hidden fortune belonged to them by right of blood despite having sold the property that contained it. Thomas had discovered that fortune through accident and desperation, had fought to keep it because fighting was the only option that didn't mean teaching Lucy to surrender when powerful people made life difficult. The renovation continued through the following year, the Cannery slowly transforming from condemned industrial building to mixed-use development that honored its history while creating modern utility. The apartments on the upper floors attracted young professionals drawn to historic character and river views. The ground floor commercial spaces housed a brewery, an artisan bakery, a bookstore that specialized in regional history. The building that had been dead for decades became alive with activity and purpose, proof that abandoned places could be reclaimed when someone was willing to do the work. Thomas and Lucy moved into one of the Cannery apartments, the irony not lost on him that the building he'd bought as desperate shelter had become actual home through years of stubborn work and community support. Lucy's room overlooked the river, her walls decorated with photographs documenting the Cannery's transformation from condemned wreck to functioning property. On a warm evening in late summer, 3 years after buying the Cannery at auction, Thomas stood on the building's roof deck watching sunset paint the river in colors that made the water look like moving metal. Lucy sat beside him, now 10 years old and shaped by years that had taught her lessons about persistence and fighting for things and the cost of standing for principles. "Do you think Mom would be proud of what we did?" Lucy asked, her voice carrying the weight of someone who was old enough now to understand how close they'd come to losing everything, how much the Cannery had represented both risk and salvation. Thomas thought about his wife, about the woman who'd died too young and left them navigating grief and medical debt and circumstances that had led to desperate gambles. "I think she'd be proud that we didn't give up when things got hard, that we stood for something when surrendering would have been easier. That's what she always believed in, fighting for things that mattered even when fighting was expensive." They sat together as darkness settled over the Cannery and lights came on in windows that had been broken for decades, in commercial spaces that hummed with activity, in apartments where people were living lives in a building that had been dead until someone desperate enough bought it and stubborn enough kept it when people with resources tried to take it away. The river flowed past carrying water that had witnessed the Cannery's construction and operation, that had been here when Samuel Caldwell had built his smuggling operation and hidden alcohol he'd never sold, that had continued flowing through decades of abandonment until Thomas and Lucy had arrived desperate and had found in that desperation the beginning of something that looked like security and purpose and home. The building breathed in the evening air, transformed from decay to vitality, from condemned liability to productive property, from the ending of one family's obsession to the foundation of another family's recovery. Samuel Caldwell had died protecting his hidden fortune. 3 generations of Caldwells had spent their lives trying to reclaim it. And Thomas had stumbled into ownership through county auction and desperation, had discovered what others had been seeking but had understood something they never had, that inheritance meant more than believing you deserve things. That legacy was built through work and persistence rather than through family mythology and entitlement. The Cannery had given Thomas more than money or property. It had given him purpose when purpose had seemed impossible, had forced him to fight when fighting revealed strength he didn't know he had shown him that communities supported people who stood for principles even when standing was expensive and uncertain. The building that had represented his most desperate gamble had become proof that sometimes the only move left when you've lost everything is the move that looks impossible, and sometimes impossible moves worked out when you were too stubborn to admit defeat. Lucy leaned against him as stars appeared overhead, both of them comfortable in the silence of people who'd been through struggle together and had emerged changed but intact. The Cannery stood beneath them solid and purposeful, monument to the idea that abandoned things could be reclaimed when someone cared enough to do the work, that desperate gambles sometimes paid off, that standing against people who believed they deserved what you'd legitimately claimed was worth the cost when you measured worth through what you taught your daughter about courage and integrity and the difference between surrendering and persisting. 3 years had transformed everything, a condemned building into thriving property, desperate poverty into stable security, the isolation of grief into the belonging that came from fighting for something and discovering that people supported those fights when they were rooted in principle rather than just self-interest. The river would continue flowing long after Thomas and Lucy were gone, would witness whatever came next for the cannery and for the town that had watched one family's obsession finally end and another family's recovery slowly take root in a building that had waited through decades of abandonment for someone desperate enough to claim it and stubborn enough to keep it when keeping it required standing for things that powerful people wanted taken. The work wasn't finished, would never be fully finished because buildings required ongoing care and relationships required ongoing attention and life kept presenting new challenges regardless of past victories. But standing on that roof deck with his daughter beside him and the cannery alive beneath them, Thomas felt something approaching peace with the journey that had started in desperation and had led through battles and slow transformation to this moment of quiet triumph that wasn't dramatic but was real and was earned and was enough. 15 years passed like seasons across the river, each one leaving its mark on the cannery the way water shapes stone. Thomas watched Lucy grow from the 7-year-old girl who'd sat beside him at that county auction into a 22-year-old woman graduating with a degree in historic preservation, her thesis focused on adaptive reuse of industrial buildings in small towns, a topic she'd been researching since the day they'd moved into a condemned cannery with nothing but desperation and $460. The building had transformed with them. What had been decay was now purposeful vitality, the cannery restored with respect for what it had been while serving present needs. The apartment stayed full with waiting lists, young families and professionals drawn to the combination of historic character and river views. The commercial spaces had become anchors for downtown revival, the brewery won regional awards, the bakery supplied restaurants across 3 counties, the bookstore hosted author events that drew crowds from Portland. But more than economic success, the cannery had become proof that abandoned things could be reclaimed, that desperate gambles sometimes led to places that honored both the desperation and the courage it took to try. Thomas had never forgotten standing in that basement 15 years ago discovering Prohibition-era bottles that represented either salvation or complication, making choices that would define whether desperation led them to security or to battles that would consume whatever hope they had left. The money from the alcohol auction had been substantial but not unlimited. After taxes and paying off medical debt, Thomas had invested the remainder into the cannery's renovation, choosing to build something lasting rather than simply banking wealth. The decision had been both practical and philosophical. He wanted Lucy to learn that inheritance meant more than receiving money, that true security came from building things that served purposes beyond personal comfort. Frances, Mrs. Peterson's mother who'd rented them the house when they'd needed it most, had passed away 3 years ago at 81. She'd left the rental house to Thomas in her will, a gesture that had surprised him until he'd read her note. You kept your word when keeping it was hard. Lucy deserves stability you provided even when providing it cost you. That's worth more than rent payments. The house had become their home base even as the cannery apartment became available, a reminder of community support that had sustained them when they'd had nothing. Thomas had kept it maintained with the same care he'd promised Frances, had eventually sold it to a young family for below market value with owner financing that made home ownership possible for people in circumstances he remembered too well. Margaret Torres had become more than Thomas's lawyer over the years. She'd become a friend, someone who understood the intersection of property rights and human struggle, who'd guided him through legal complexities with patience and expertise. She'd never charged more than contingency fees they'd agreed to initially, had seen the cannery project through to completion despite offers from larger firms that would have paid better. You reminded me why I went to law school, Margaret had told Thomas during one of their final meetings after the renovation was complete. Not to make money helping corporations acquire property, but to help individuals defend what was rightfully theirs against people with more resources. Your fight mattered beyond just you and Lucy, it showed that standing ground was possible even when the odds looked impossible. The Caldwell family's story had found its own resolution in ways Thomas hadn't anticipated. Robert Caldwell had died 6 years ago at 78, his obituary noting business accomplishments but conspicuously avoiding mention of the cannery obsession that had consumed his final decades. David Caldwell had attended the funeral, had sought out Thomas afterward in an encounter that had felt both awkward and necessary. My father died angry about the cannery, convinced until the end that you'd stolen what belonged to us, David had said quietly. But in his final years, I think he knew the anger was really about his own father's disappointments, about feeling he'd failed to honor some imagined family duty. I'm sorry we made your life difficult. You fought for what was yours with more integrity than we showed trying to take it. The apology had mattered not because it changed what had happened but because it acknowledged truth that grudges often obscured. The Caldwell family had spent 3 generations believing Samuel's hidden fortune was inheritance they deserved, had pursued that belief through methods that revealed obsession rather than principle. Thomas had simply refused to surrender to pressure, had stood ground because teaching Lucy about integrity mattered more than accepting money that came with the cost of demonstrating that powerful people always won. David had done something unexpected after his father's death. He donated the Caldwell family's historical records to the Cannery's small museum, ledgers, photographs, documents that told the full story of Samuel's Prohibition operations and the subsequent generations' pursuit of what he'd hidden. The donation had come with a note: "This history belongs with the building, not with a family that spent too long trying to reclaim what we'd forfeited through our own choices." The museum had grown beyond Thomas's initial vision. It documented not just the cannery's industrial history but the broader story of Prohibition-era smuggling along the Willamette River, the economic forces that had created and then destroyed rural industries, the human cost of obsession and the healing that came from letting go of things that couldn't be reclaimed. School groups visited regularly, learning about history through a building that had been saved from demolition through one man's desperate gamble and stubborn persistence. Lucy had worked at the museum through high school and college, had developed passion for historic preservation that was rooted in watching her father transform a condemned building into thriving property. Her graduation thesis had won awards, had been published in preservation journals, had established her as someone who understood both the technical aspects of adaptive reuse and the human stories that made buildings worth saving. "I want to help other families in situations like ours," Lucy had told Thomas during her final semester. "People who inherit old buildings or find themselves owning properties they don't know how to develop. There should be models for doing this work that don't require being desperate or lucky, that provide pathways for regular people to reclaim industrial heritage." Her career path reminded Thomas of how inheritance worked when families paid attention, not just passing down property or money but passing forward the lessons learned through struggle and the commitment to using what you'd been given to help others navigate similar challenges. Lucy had grown up watching her father fight for the cannery, had absorbed lessons about persistence and integrity that would shape how she approached her own work. On a cool evening in late October, 20 years after buying the cannery at auction, Thomas stood on the building's roof deck watching sunset paint the river in colors that made the water look like it was carrying light downstream. The brewery was hosting a celebration below, the cannery's 20th anniversary as restored property, recognition of what had been built from desperation and discovered bottles in stubborn refusal to surrender. Lucy found him there as darkness settled, both of them comfortable in the silence that had developed through 2 decades of shared experience. She was preparing to move to Seattle for a position with a historic preservation nonprofit, her first job after graduation, the beginning of a career that would take her beyond Riverside but that was rooted in everything the cannery had taught her. "I've been thinking about Mom," Lucy said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of someone who was old enough now to understand how much her mother's death had shaped their journey. About how losing her led to all of this, the medical debt, the eviction, the desperate bid at the auction. "If she hadn't died, we probably wouldn't have the cannery, wouldn't have learned what we learned, wouldn't be who we are." Thomas felt the familiar ache that thinking about his wife always brought, tempered now by years but never fully healed. "I'd trade everything we built to have her back, to give you the childhood with both parents that you deserved. But you're right that her death led to choices that shaped us. Sometimes the worst things that happen create conditions for growth we wouldn't have found otherwise." "Do you think she'd be proud?" "I think she'd be amazed that we turned a condemned cannery into this, that we fought off people who tried to take it from us, that we built something that serves the community while providing security for us." Thomas paused, looking at the building that had been his most desperate gamble. "But more than the success, I think she'd be proud that we didn't give up when giving up would have been easier, that we showed each other what standing for things actually costs." They stood together as the celebration continued below, voices and laughter rising from a building that had been silent for decades before Thomas had bought it with money he couldn't afford to spend. The cannery had given them more than shelter or income, it had given them purpose when purpose had seemed impossible, had forced them to fight when fighting revealed strength they hadn't known they possessed, had shown them that communities supported people who stood for principles even when standing was expensive. The museum's collection included artifacts from every era of the cannery's history. The industrial equipment from the original canning operations, maintained as sculpture and teaching tools. The bottles from Samuel Caldwell's Prohibition cache, a few kept as historical examples while most had been sold to fund the renovation. The documents David Caldwell had donated, showing 3 generations of obsession and the cost it had exacted. The photographs Thomas had taken during early renovation, showing the building's transformation from condemned wreck to functioning property. But the most meaningful artifact was simpler, the auction receipt showing Thomas's winning bid of $460, framed alongside the eviction notice from the apartment they'd lost and Lucy's first drawing of what the cannery might become after they fixed it. The display told a story about desperation and hope, about choices made when all options looked impossible, about the difference between surrendering to circumstances and fighting to change them. Helen Marsh, the retired county recorder who'd first told Thomas about the Caldwell family's history, still visited the cannery regularly at 89. She'd become unofficial historian of the building's transformation, documenting each stage of renovation, interviewing everyone involved in the project for oral history records that would preserve the full story. "You proved something important," Helen had told Thomas during one of her recent visits. "You proved that ordinary people could stand against families with resources and history and patience, that legal ownership mattered even when defending it required fighting people who believed they deserved what you'd legitimately claimed. That lesson extends beyond just this building, it's about whether property rights mean anything when powerful people decide they want what you have." The brewery owner, Marcus Chen, had become close friend over the years they'd worked together in the cannery. He'd taken a chance on leasing commercial space in a building that was still being renovated, had trusted Thomas's vision when others had been skeptical about investing in a property with such complicated history. "You gave me space to build something when banks wouldn't loan money to someone with my background," Marcus had said during the anniversary celebration. Chinese immigrant without credit history, trying to start a brewery in a small Oregon town. "You rented to me based on handshake and business plan, didn't ask for deposits I couldn't afford." That's the kind of community building that actually matters. As midnight approached and the celebration wound down, Thomas walked through the cannery one final time before heading home. Through the commercial spaces that hummed with activity even late at night, through hallways that had been filled with debris but were now clean and purposeful, through the basement where he'd discovered the hidden room that had changed everything. The false panel had been preserved but was now clearly marked, historical feature rather than secret. The room behind it housed part of the museum's collection, its walls lined with photographs and documents telling the story of Prohibition smuggling and the 3 generations of Caldwells who tried to reclaim what Samuel had hidden. Visitors could stand where Thomas had stood 20 years ago making discoveries that would define whether desperation led to salvation or to battles that would consume whatever hope they had left. He thought about that moment, the flashlight revealing crates of whiskey, the understanding that he'd found something valuable but complicated, the choice to fight for it rather than surrender to people who showed up too quickly with offers that were either generous or calculated to steal what they couldn't claim legally. The choice had been both simple and impossibly difficult, had required standing for principles when standing meant risking the only asset he had and the custody of the daughter who was watching him make decisions that would teach her what fighting for things actually meant. 20 years had proven the choice was right, but Thomas remembered how uncertain it had felt making it, how close they'd come to losing everything, how many moments he'd questioned whether pride and principle were worth the cost they were exacting on a 7-year-old girl who deserved stability more than she deserved lessons about integrity. Lucy had thrived despite or maybe because of the struggle, had learned through watching her father fight that standing for things mattered even when standing was expensive. She'd grown into a woman who understood that inheritance meant more than receiving, it meant honoring trust placed in you by building something that served purposes beyond personal benefit. The river flowed past in darkness, carrying water that had witnessed the cannery's construction and operation, that had been here when Samuel Caldwell had built his smuggling operation and hidden alcohol he'd never sold, that had continued flowing through 8 decades of abandonment until Thomas and Lucy had arrived desperate and had found in that desperation the seeds of something that looked like recovery and purpose and home. Thomas stood at the river's edge feeling the weight of 20 years settle into something approaching completion. Not ending, because the work would continue, buildings required ongoing care, communities needed constant attention, life kept presenting new challenges regardless of past victories. But closure on the journey that had started with a county auction and desperate gamble, that had led through discovery and battles and slow transformation of both property and people. The cannery would stand long after Thomas was gone, would continue serving and teaching, would remain proof that desperate gambles sometimes paid off when people were stubborn enough to stand against pressure and lucky enough to find community support when support mattered most. Samuel Caldwell had hidden a fortune and died before claiming it. 3 generations of Caldwells had pursued that fortune believing it was inheritance they deserved. And Thomas had discovered it through accident and desperation, had fought to keep it because fighting was the only move that didn't mean teaching Lucy to surrender when powerful people made life difficult. The building breathed in the night air, alive with purpose after decades of death, transformed from industrial abandonment to mixed-use vitality that honored history while serving present needs. The work hadn't been perfect, renovation had revealed problems that cost more than projected, some original features had been lost to necessary modernization, compromises had been made between historic preservation and practical function. But the imperfect work had been good enough, had saved a building that would otherwise have been demolished, had created housing and jobs and community gathering spaces in a town that needed all 3. Lucy would carry forward lessons learned here, that buildings were worth fighting for, that adaptive reuse was possible when people brought patience and persistence, that communities supported those fights when they were rooted in serving purposes beyond personal gain. She'd face her own battles in historic preservation work, would make her own desperate gambles and stand her own ground against people who believed power and resources rendered principles irrelevant. But she'd do it knowing that her father had stood against the Caldwell family when standing had looked impossible, had refused to surrender property he'd legitimately claimed even when surrendering would have been easier and more profitable in the short term. Those lessons would serve her well in work that required fighting for buildings and communities that powerful people wanted demolished or gentrified or transformed into something that served development interests rather than human needs. The stars wheeled overhead in patterns that had looked down on this land before the cannery was built, before Samuel Caldwell had run his smuggling operation, before Thomas had made his desperate bid, before any of the human struggles that had shaped this place. They'd continue after everyone currently alive was gone, witnessing the slow work of buildings being saved and communities being sustained and families choosing to build rather than simply inherit. Thomas walked back through the cannery one final time, through spaces that had been transformed from decay to purpose, past the museum that told stories about prohibition and obsession and the cost of fighting for things, through the commercial spaces where people were building livelihoods in a building that had been dead until someone desperate enough had bought it and stubborn enough had kept it. The auction receipt hung in the museum, for $160 that had represented everything he'd had left after paying utilities and buying groceries, the exact amount that had meant choosing between security deposits on apartments he couldn't afford or gambling on property he might be able to salvage into something. The gamble had paid off in ways that went beyond money into the realm of proving that desperate people who tried impossible things sometimes got rewarded with chances to become who they were meant to be. Lucy was right that her mother's death had led to all of this, that medical debt and eviction and desperation had created conditions for transformation they wouldn't have found otherwise. But Thomas would still trade everything they'd built to have his wife back, to give Lucy the childhood with both parents that sudden cardiac arrest had stolen. Some losses couldn't be redeemed through success that followed them, could only be accepted as permanent absences that shaped but didn't define the lives that continued after them. The cannery stood as monument to what could be built from loss and desperation and stubborn refusal to surrender. Not perfect transformation because life didn't offer those, but good enough reclamation of something abandoned, proof that buildings and people could be saved when someone cared enough to fight for them even when fighting looked impossible and expensive and likely to fail. 20 years had transformed a condemned industrial building into living property, had changed a desperate father into someone who'd built security for his daughter while teaching her lessons about integrity and persistence, had shown that communities supported people who stood for principles even when standing required resources they didn't have and courage they had to discover through fighting. The river would flow past long after the cannery and Thomas and everyone who'd been part of this story were gone, would carry water that remembered nothing and everything, that witnessed transformation and decay with the same indifference, that connected this place to distant oceans through paths that cared nothing for human struggles but that sustained the landscapes where those struggles played out. Thomas locked the cannery and walked to his truck, the building solid behind him against the night sky, proof that what was worth defending could be defended when people were desperate enough or stubborn enough or principled enough to stand against forces that measured success through acquisition rather than creation. The journey from that county auction to this moment had been longer and harder than he'd imagined when bidding $460 on property he'd never seen inside, but it had been worth every difficult choice and expensive stand and moment when surrender would have been easier than persistence. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.